from you all, what you've heard this morning from our esteemed panel.
For me personally, teaching elementary school, teaching 5th grade, we're K-6 up in Forest Lake. So my question is, how would you address some of these things to say 5th grade, a 4th grade, a 3rd grade student, so I can bring some of this back to my school and kind of say, like, here's some things we can do, is get the ball rolling.
So when I was in the 5th grade, I think Trayvon got shot. And I don't recall at all having a conversation about that and about what happened. And I remember feeling very like stuck and that like I was the only one who was following this on the news and like looking at this on Facebook, and I don't know, I felt like I was really alone in processing my feelings, and I couldn't come to my teacher about that because she was a white woman and she wouldn't understand. So I think there's a lot of like, there's this big idea that kids from K to 6 can't understand these conversations, but Black and brown kids are living these conversations. So we can have these conversations with these kids, and there are ways to do it where it doesn't feel like a big burden, because we don't want to burden these kids with what society's putting onto them, but to have that conversation and have to know that your teachers are aware that you're going through this, or aware that people who look like you are going through this, and you care enough to have this conversation about that and want to process their emotions with you, then that makes everything more better, and that makes that space feel like a safe space to be able to have more conversations like that.
I would say oftentimes the younger children are the less of a voice that we give them. And I've actually found that the younger they are, I'm like, wow, you're actually like, not a lot smarter, but like you actually comprehend this better than some adults that I speak to. Some of the most deepest talks I've had is actually with elementary kids. And I was like, oh, and the only reason I was able to have that conversation is because I allowed them to initiate that conversation. So I would say for you, giving them a space, or giving them the opportunity to actually have a voice, and that's why I bring up the point of like a lot of times we don't give them a voice because it's like, you're a kid, what do you know? But they actually soak up and like experience more than we think, and a lot of times they won't say anything because we don't give them that outlet. So that's what I would say, like figuring out a specific time to initiate the conversation, especially with kids. You have to like, sometimes you have to let them kind of talk about it first, where like an adult or a teenager will kind of just say it to you. You kind of have to give them that push and like let them know the space is open to talk about it. And I think if you did that, then you'll find that like they are experiencing this and soaking up a lot more than we actually realize. So give them a voice and give them that opportunity to have a voice, an honest voice. Like I would say literally giving them, not having like a whole curriculum, like we're gonna talk about this point, literally like giving them, let's talk about this subject, how do you guys wanna talk about it? Do you guys wanna write about it? Do you wanna rap about it? Do you want, how do we need to figure out a way for you guys to actually communicate so they can release some of the stuff too? Because I think that's the problem with younger kids. We don't let them just release how they need to release. So not just even, that's the other thing that I would say, not even necessarily just having a conversation, figure out how they want to discuss it or how they want to express it and allowing them to do it that way.
Shaughnessy and I did a camp, I think it was about 2 summers ago now, with kids that were in 6th and 7th grade, I think, it was 7th grade maybe. And I just remember having conversations about inequality, equity in their schools, and them being able to articulate themselves in a way that I had not even thought about, right? Like we were going through these simulations of what had happened to other people's, and these kids were already going through it in their everyday lives. Like, I think that underestimating a kid is the biggest injustice you can ever do as a teacher, right? Like from the jump, like underestimating any kid, thinking that they're any less than what they are. Like what kind of relationship, what kind of rapport can you develop when you already are downing that kid from the jump? And as being the person in that situation with this power or this influence over this person, like, it just sets a tone. So I think that, yeah, that's what I would say. Like, that's the biggest injustice you can do. Like, you really need to let these kids show you what they're made of, because every time I'm always blown away with what kids give you. Like, my dad has always told me, from the mouths of babes come wonders, and like, that's a real thing I live by every day.
I would say for like younger kids, it's really about like giving them a space to process. And we talked about like how students need to process, but I think especially for younger kids, like, because a lot of like what you do as an adult, or like as you can do for high school students, is like, let's present this thing and let's all think critically about it. But for younger kids, like, they just want a space where they can come in and like talk about this stuff, right? And so when you are a child who just saw someone get shot on TV, because information is out there and they're going to see it, right? Your TV's on, they're on iPads, they're on telephones, like, you're always going to see it, right? But then you see this thing and you're like, I don't know how to talk about it. It's just like, that's how we all are as children, is like, you saw this thing and you're like, this doesn't look right, but I don't know how to explain how it doesn't look right, right? So having the space to be able to process something, and so as a teacher, it's like sort of your job to say, hey, this is what happened in the news today, let's talk about the current events, right? I was in the 5th grade. When I was in the 5th grade was when like Obama was getting elected for the first time, and our teacher, she made it, Miss Christine, she like made it about like, let's talk about this election like process. Let's go through the steps of what it looks like to do this thing, right? And so as kids, we were learning these things, but also we were enjoying ourselves. And then I could go home, watch the news, see something that was going on, and be like, yo, Mom, we talked about this in school. I know exactly what that means. I know what the Electoral College is all about. And that's just because my teacher was able to do that for me, right? And so if you're in that space and you bring it up with your students, you're like, this is what happened on the news today. And your students are talking about it, they go home, watch the news, and things are becoming more clear for them, right? They're being able to put words, but also like understand different ways that it goes, and like that. And not even just like what's going on in the news, but like what's going on in their classrooms, right? What does it look like if your students are segregating by race? If they are segregating by gender, like, how are you talking to them about that? Being a student that, like, when I went to school, I was like, free reduced lunch. Like, I was like, I'm getting free lunch, woo woo. Didn't understand it was about my economic status, right? Didn't understand that it was because I was coming from a household where my parents weren't making as much money as like some of the other students, right? And then what did it look like for me to be eating like school lunch while somebody else had like a mom who could pack lunches for them and they could come in, right? How are we, and then getting like older, a little bit older, you get to 6th grade and you start to understand those things. And then you're like, well, no one ever explained this to me. Right. And then you're having like hushed conversations with your teachers where they're like, hey, so like, listen, if you want, like, you don't have to pay for this field trip because of this reason, because we feel like we can't talk about these things, but socioeconomic status is a big thing. It's something that like a lot of students are dealing with in their homes, can't go home and have food, can't go home and have a place to do certain things. But if you can have that conversation with your students and say, hey, like, the reason for why this student can't do this is because of this, and then like you're just giving them a space to talk about how they feel about their circumstances, and then they can go out, go home, and then have these more conversations with their parents, which also brings them back to come and talk some more, right? And so it's like giving them a space of process is really like all that's important.
One thing that I've definitely learned is being comfortable with being uncomfortable, because most of these conversations are, especially for like white teachers, are going to be uncomfortable because it's unrelatable, kind of, but kind of what everyone else has been saying, like what you see on the news, a lot of these kids are living that, and so whether you know it or not, like it's something that needs to be talked about in classrooms, especially like she said, we spend most of our time in a classroom. So like kind of the other day that my family went to a remembrance thing for Philandro Castile, and there was a little girl, she was probably in elementary school, like 5, and she had a piece of, they let the kids like write on the sidewalk, and she wrote like, I miss you, Mr. Phil. And like it's little, like these things are affecting little kids, and like we have to start doing something about, because it's not fair to these little kids to grow up in the world that we live in.
All right, so my junior year, we had a student volunteer class with BPO. We would go down to the middle school area during their like 6th hour, and we would like educate them. We would be like a role model to the students. So what I did for my 6th grade class, I forgot what the difference, what the word was, but I taught them the difference between racism and prejudice. Thank you. Yeah, I taught them the difference between that, and like it really opened up their eyes. Like it gave them a little like awareness. So my advice is like educate your students a little. Like if you teach them at a younger age, I feel like that they'll be more well educated once they get into the real world, or once they get into high school at least, or middle school. So that's my advice to that.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.